But look, can I thank Andy and Dan and the crew for asking me to come along. And in October last year, I spoke to a DFA meeting in Wellington, just outlining some of the things that were going on with a very early stage PGP program of ours that had been a long time in the gestation, but was just starting to get up and running. And so Dan and Tony asked me if I'd come back and just have a bit of a talk about where we're up to. So they asked me to talk about the Red Meat Profit Partnership, but also what I want to do is I want to talk about some thinking that it's prompted, because that's sort of where we're at. And in fact, this morning, the reason I couldn't be here earlier in the day was I was talking to the leadership team at AgResearch about when they think about doing R&D, in terms of some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about here today, how do they engage with organisations like ours to think about extension right at the very start of those R&D programs, and how would we do that better together? So I'm going to go a little bit quickly through just some background, because I think it's important to set the context of how we've ended up where we are and why we're thinking about some of the things that we, as an organisation, Beef and Lamb, but also alongside others, partners in this program, but also others are thinking about the things we're thinking about at the moment. So in 2011, we worked with the Meat Industry Association and also with MPI and New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, the government's trade development agency, to do a red meat sector strategy. And one of the real risks with strategies like this is they gather dust and they sit on bookshelves or drawers or whatever the analogy is, but they're not really talked about. And we were quite determined organisationally, and certainly our board was as well, to think quite deeply about keeping the thing alive, but also thinking about what did it mean for us in terms of changing our programs and being more effective for farmers over time. So don't worry too much about the diagram on the right-hand side, but there were three things that were talked about as being important for the sector in the future. So increased coordination of market behaviour was an in-market component, and thinking about some of those two on-farm and marketing components of your PGP program, I guess, has got some elements of that. Efficient and aligned procurement, farm gate into plant, but the one for us that we really thought about was sector best practice. So there's a processing component to that, but some of the analysis that's sat behind that in terms of informing the strategy itself has really been fundamental in changing our view and becoming a much more farmer-focused and farmer-directed organisation over the last 4 or 5 years. If you've been to one of our field days, and we run about 360 of these things a year now, you may well have seen this diagram. And so what it does is it looks at the profit distribution of sheep and beef farmers. This is Beef and Lamb Economic Service data. And it looks at 2 years. So 1990-91, and we use that, I guess, baseline because that's a point, it's a nice round number, it's the start of a decade, but it's also a point where we think a lot of that change and reform that went on through the 80s had swept out of the system, and it was sort of in the world that we live in now. And then when we did this piece of analysis, we looked at 11-12. A couple of things here. I should just say that our economists have done, I think they call it detrended and de-inflated the data, which means you can compare the 2 years, so you can make them apples for apples. But for me, it's all about the massive distribution of profitability there. So break even is just here, that's zero. If you're on the left-hand side of that, you're making a loss. If you're on the right-hand side of that line, that virtual line, if you like, you're making a profit. And obviously, it hasn't changed much over time, in the sense that the nature of the curve changes year on year. So if I put up a 12-13 year or 13-14 year, the relationship would look slightly different. But, there is still that significant distribution within the whole sheep and beef farming population. But even the farmers that are out the right-hand side, the very far right-hand side of that, are using things that are available to them today: resources, technologies, innovations, advice, skills, etc., etc. And so what is it that allows those farms to be out the right-hand side, but perhaps some others to not be out the right-hand side? And so fundamentally, I think that's a really important conversation, something, as I say, we've been thinking about. I do have a question, and I say this quite a bit now at farmer groups, of are we talking about the right things when we talk amongst ourselves as a sector? And I'm going to use an example. And I think we as an organisation, I'll put us in the spotlight here, need to think about our own communications with farmers and the broader sector in the same light. So, classic benchmarking stuff. This is quintile data, so think of 20% slices of the farming population, rather than often we talk about quartiles, which are 25%. We've taken the second one from the bottom, 20 to 40%, and the top 20%. And one of the things that we love to talk about in our sector is lamb price. We always talk about price per head. But when you do so, actually there's not much difference between the top performing farms and those further down that distribution in terms of lamb price. But, you know, we are guilty in our own economic service reporting. I'm seeing Andy smile, he probably knows what I'm going to say, that the headline always is around what's the all seasons average lamb price for the next year. And so when we put out a new season forecast, the thing that the journalists always ask us about, which is sort of a reflection of the culture in the sector, is what is that per head lamb price? But my point is to say that in terms of where you sit on that profit distribution, it's actually not very important in any given year. Because the things that really make a difference are those productivity measures. And so if we look at lamb sales on a kilogram per hectare basis or a dollar per hectare basis, there are very big differences between where you sit on the curve and performance against those. And we could look at all sorts of other measures, productivity measures as well. So my point really is to say often our discussion in our sector doesn't reflect the things that are really important. I think we've all got to try and change that and keep it moving on. We have a role in that, but also as a community in our sector, in the red meat sector, in our sheep and beef sector, we have a role in doing that. But the other point is that those incremental productivity improvements that we continue to make and can continue to make in our businesses every day are really, really important. The other thing that really strikes me at the moment is that in our sector, there are lots of pieces of information coming at us. And I made the point when I spoke to AgResearch this morning, I can remember I hadn't been with then Meat and Wool very long. And one of our directors collected all the mail that came into their farm mailbox over 2 weeks and brought it to Wellington to the next board meeting. And I think they came with about 4 or 5 pack and save bags, loaded up with stuff. And so it's sort of a bit of a visual thing for me to think about how many different organisations, different businesses are trying to provide us with information. Now, some of it is pure junk mail. It's transactional stuff about whatever's on special. But a lot of it is technical information as well, and I think that's deeply confusing. And for example, it can lead, in my view, it can lead to inaction. So if you've got different bits of information being given to you about different approaches to the same issue, whether that's animal health, worm control might be an example, often it can lead to inaction. Inaction can lead to problems on farm. And so one of the things we've been focused on is how do you get better coordination at the pre-competitive level? So not cutting across competition, because that rises, it creates innovation and the rising tide lifts all boats to some extent. But in those things that are just basic core technical information, how do you get common messaging to take away some of that confusion and potential confusion? So just very quickly, I wanted, and this actually covers some of the issues that were talked about in a couple of the sessions that I've stood down the back and a couple of the speakers I've heard over the last hour or so. So I just want to touch in terms of our strategy and why this is important to beef and lamb. I'm not going to go through all of this, so don't worry. But I do want to talk about a couple of elements here that I think are really important. So when we redid our strategy a couple of years ago, about 18 months ago, we added a word into what we wanted to see in the sector, and that was confidence. And I think, Anna, it might have been you spoke about confidence in your presentation. How we bring confidence into our conversations and talk about what we can do and the steps we can make as a sector and in individual businesses, I think is really important. And so I want to touch on that around some data coming out of the Red Meat Profit Partnership in just a moment. But also I think it's important, and we heard it again in the last session, and I hadn't lined any of this up, but it's nice to see similar themes coming through, that whether we're farmers working in a community or service businesses and organisations within the broader sector, how do we help farmers make informed business decisions and think about our farms as family farms and within communities, but also how do we think about them as businesses as well? And I'll touch on some components around that in just a moment. At the end of the day, though, while we can think about businesses and we can do budgets and business plans and we can successfully and prepare for succession perhaps better than we do it today, the farming systems in New Zealand are fundamentally about people and about families. And so a real risk in service delivery for organisations like ours is, so I'm a ruminant nutritionist, I'm passionate about ruminant nutrition, don't do much of it anymore, but I still love being involved in animal science and thinking about that sort of stuff. But often what we don't think about is you, as farmers, carefully enough when we construct those systems to help you do the informed decision making within your businesses. And so One of the things that I'm going to walk through now is some of this early data coming out of Red Meat Profit Partnership, which puts family and values and community right at the heart of decision making of the very highest performing farms. And that's making us think quite deeply about how we design better extension services going forward. So how do we meet all of the needs of people like this? So these are photos from one of our extension days. How do we meet the full suite of needs with better products and services going forward? So when we started thinking about the Red Meat Profit Partnership, and I'll talk about who the partners are, there are some in this room, we started off with a bit of a discussion about, gee, we must need databases and better tools and decision support stuff and software. And sort of where we ended up was actually there are lots of those things already, but often there isn't confidence and capability and an understanding about how you use those to drive some of those business decisions effectively enough. And so it went from being a piece of technology development and science to some extent, and certainly innovation in the broader sense, to actually being a program that's much more focused around people and decision making. There are a number of partners in the program, and so we've got them indicated here. We've got 6 meat processors: Alliance, ANZCO, Blue Sky Meats. If you don't, Blue Sky are a small sheep meat processor in the bottom of the South Island, Greenleaf from the Waikato beef, Progressive here on the East Coast, Silver Fern Farms, and 2 banks, ANZ and Rabo. And the banks are very focused around the business literacy component, and so that's skills development around building business skills, budgeting, financial planning, succession planning, and how do you support sheep and beef farmers in that sense. And obviously Ministry for Primary Industries are a 50% funder of the program through the Primary Growth Partnership. So coming together around a shared interest of how do we have a much stronger and more profitable and I guess more sustainable in the very broadest sense sheep and beef farming population to support their interests and their desires going forward, and how could we work collectively to do that? Oops. So it's got an objective around driving sustainable profitability, productivity improvements, so those productivity improvements and focusing on the things that really make a difference. So not the lamb head, the per head lamb price, but you know, very much on those productivity measures are really key here. And it looks at a number of different areas, so management skills, information and systems, so there is some database work, but a lot of linking of current systems so that they're easier to use. And also about how do you link things like breeding and selection, pasture and forage and applied farm systems into better management decision making as well. So there's a very large program within it looking at extension networks and the integration of processors, banks, farmers and other agribusiness service providers to do that in a fundamentally different way. Very quickly, the different components across the bottom of the diagram here, there's work around people. How do we bring the next generation through? And how do we support them in early career development once they're in the sector as well, so that they're not lost? A big piece around extension design, so thinking fundamentally about farmer needs and how do we go from a very technologically led system to one that's inherently designed around farmers. Data systems, common language, common metrics, simplicity. How do we get more farmers to think about benchmarking? Standardised QA, developing a simple baseline QA program that's shared. New Zealand's story is around what are the great things about our farming systems and about our farms and our people that we can, and about our regulations, and how do we flip those around and make them fundamentally valuable in the context of our New Zealand story. So some work around that and putting good data against that, and also a piece looking at what are the potential financial gains and pathways around efficiency in that farm to processor component. But I want to now just talk about some of the early stage. So Project 1 is called Understanding Behaviour Change, and the focus for us in this as a group has been looking at how do we understand the needs of farmers better, farmers as a whole, but also how do we understand what drives very high performing farms. And this is a great quote that came out of the focus group research, and I think it really sums up some of the things that we're trying to build into our program. Some of it we've done innately, but not necessarily deliberately designed in, and we want to design them in much more deliberately going forward. So this is a farmer, male farmer, Pew Pew, saying farmers are always looking over the fence at the next door neighbours and people down the road. If it turns out to be a good idea, they will do it. They have to be left to make up their own minds. They're stubborn and independent. Won't comment on that. I'll just see if that sort of resonates in the audience. You can't tell them something, they have to absorb it. Now, often within our extension activity, we want to see the sort of response and the practice change, happen like that. But of course, what this says is it's a much slower process and a much more organic process to some extent. So it's not just about the event, the field day, the look at forage cropping or whatever it might be, but what is everything else we need to wrap into that system to support that farmer to make the change? So how do we allow farmers to own the ideas, and how do we listen and tailor? So whether you're a farmer involved in those processes as a user within your own community, or whether you're a service provider, someone like me, I think there are some really interesting messages here to think about how we do this stuff better collectively. The work also looked at what are some other channels that aid change, and this does tap into some of the things that were talked about in the last panel discussion, the last couple of presenters. So who is it that can support that change after there's that awareness or that new knowledge? 80% of farmers said other farmers. Sort of goes back to the previous quote. 72% said my spouse or my family. And obviously, the vast bulk, 90-something% of our farms in New Zealand are family farms. So that family unit and family values are really important. 70% said vets. So vets always, and I've got another piece of data here in a moment to show that vets always come up the list of trusted advisors. And then 64 to 67% said events with farmers and experts. So again, that peer-to-peer learning, farmers talking to one another, looking at stuff and thinking about what it means for themselves. So whether it's the work that you're doing through the advanced parties, the PGP program, or other extension events in the sector, that getting farmers together to think about stuff is still a key learning platform for us moving forward. This is some work that we've done ourselves. We do assessment of preferred communication channels and trusted advisors. So this is the advisor component every quarter, just to see if things are changing around. And there will be some horrified looks at where farm consultants come on this list, and I'll preempt that question. I'm looking at Andy. I did this presentation to a Pharmax group, and I should have thought more clearly before I put this up on the stage, on the screen, I have to say, because the vast bulk of the audience was farm consultants. So, but vets, rural accountants way up there. We've done this over time to see if we were moving up this list, and so I'm pleased to say that we have been over time. Fertiliser reps, stock agents, banking advisors, processors, farm consultants. I genuinely believe that this is not an issue around the quality of farm consultants. I think it's an issue around how widespread their use is. And I'm strongly of the view that we need, whatever you call them, rural professionals, farm management consultants, as we move into a much more complex environment, and it's happening all the time, that those people that can integrate that knowledge, whether they're called consultants or whatever, are going to be fundamentally important to us making some of the gains that we want to make. And I'm not just saying that because Andy's in the room. But the reality is that advice is being taken from a whole bunch of service providers, whether they're transactional or technical. And so how do we meaningfully integrate them into that system as well? And think about doing that very deliberately rather than just they happen to turn up to a field day, they get a bit of knowledge and then they go away. Communication channels, so this is about stuff that we do, but my point here is to say that print media is still the preferred communication channel for farmers. And by some margin, actually. What we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years is that electronic media have moved up. I think the rural broadband rollout has been a key component of that. It's now much more doable in terms of accessing online content than it has been in the past. But print media is still the preferred communication channel for farmers. So how do you integrate all of that to get the desired outcome? And what I want to do now is just finish up around some of this data from the early stages of the Red Meat Profit Partnership, and this is the stuff that we are thinking very deeply about at the moment in terms of how do you use it. It's interesting, but how do you use it to fundamentally design better extension products and services? And then I guess as a farming community, how do we harness the power in some of this stuff to get the outcomes that we want collectively? So this comes from some analysis, very in-depth qualitative analysis. So think about quite in-depth interviews with farmers that are very, very high performing. So those that have got very high economic farm surpluses or high return on assets. And the really striking thing about this is, so I was thinking about some data. I think the data is that only about 30% of sheep and beef farmers have a farm budget, and only about 5 percentage points of that 30 percentage points really use it to drive their farm business. So the rest are sort of either not doing it or effectively it's something the accountant completes for them. And again, it's a bit like a strategy. It goes in the bottom drawer probably. So in my mind, and all sorts of assumptions in me being in this space, was that business skills and business literacy were going to be a key component of what defined high-performing farmers. That is not what the data says at all. And so the data says that the most important thing for the very high-performing farmers, in fact, was family and way of life. Now, way of life sounds quite soft, and it's not a description around we want a lifestyle, we want an easy lifestyle. But family values and the desire to be a sheep and beef family and keep a sheep and beef farmer and keep the sheep and beef farm and the family farming is really what this is about. And in fact, good profitability and good business performance were an enabler of that value-based goal. So for me, I thought it would be the other way around. I thought profitability would be a key driver and that family and way of life would be a thing that underpinned that. But the way we're thinking about this now is, if that's the most important thing, how do you build messaging around technical stuff that enables you to have a great sheep and beef farming way of life and support the family on the farm as one of the key messages that's in that? So that's the way we're trying to think about some of this stuff. I don't know what the answers to that are yet, but it is a fundamentally different way of thinking about service delivery. Around the outside, the survey work says there are a bunch of connected practices, and these are perhaps less surprising. So, in terms of family and way of life, legacy and succession planning, so that classic comment we hear from our peers all the time, I want to hand the farm on to the kids in a better condition than when I got it myself, you know. There's lots of versions of that, but that really lies at the core. There's absolutely in the profitability space things around efficiency planning, simple systems. So we heard some discussion about simplicity a little bit earlier on, good infrastructure and technology as well. There's also that passion. So we heard the discussion about passion a little bit earlier on, setting goals, ambitious plans, benchmarking. So what simple benchmarking can we do to know where we sit? It's become slightly sort of apocryphal, I think, but there's a great piece of analysis that says 80% of farmers think they're in the top 20%. Now, whether that data's right or not, you sort of intuitively know it's true. And of course, if more of us benchmarked, we'd be able to dig into the reality or the lack of reality in that little story. So benchmarking and record keeping. They're also driven by a dynamic challenge as well. So strong elements in the data coming through about they're great observers, they've got great attention to detail, and a story about one of the farmers, these very high-performing farmers, talking about that when I go out onto the farm every day, my dad said to me I should always go to the back of the farm, start there and work back towards the house. Because if I do that, I'll see the whole farm and I'll know where everything's at. And so it's really a story about attention to detail and observation. They have good pasture management skills, they intensively feed when they need to, they evaluate their stock, and genetics can be a component of that, you know, good bull selection, good ram selection, etc., etc. They've got a broader context of the industry, and so a very strong sense of community. They're active in the industry, they're solutions focused, they mix with excellence, so they're looking for those ideas and those innovators all the time. Build sound business relationships, so looking to partner and seeking expert advice. So who's got stuff that I don't have, knowledge, insight, etc., that I can pull into the business to help me do what I want to do in my own farm. And then the last one sort of builds on that a bit more, but it's around confidence. They invest, they try new ideas, they take calculated risks, and they experiment. And so often, you know, and we see this in some of our R&D and our field days, many of these farmers, and there'll be many of them in the room too, you know, you are beyond some of the sort of field-based trial work that organisations like ours do, and you're doing it yourself. And so, you know, we see interest in other areas of our programs from many of these people, whether it might be around market access or things that they can't replicate themselves. So look, it's reasonably hot off the press, this stuff. It's been around for a couple of months now, I guess, or probably 6 months. But it's sort of, I think as sectors we want to have a think about what does it mean, and so how collectively as we work within projects or as we work within industry organisations, how can we use some of this stuff to deliver better services, whether you're people who create them like me, or whether you as farmers, as users and funders of those services from an industry body point of view, how can we use some of this stuff to do that better, to deliver on the goals that you want in your own farms and in your own businesses? So I just want to end up here, and I've got a couple of photos here. Some of you might know these people. Blair and Jane Smith from North Otago. Actually, Jane is one of the independent directors on Red Meat Profit Partnership. And Martin Coop on the right-hand side, who chairs who's the national chair of our Farmer Council exec. So we have 7 farmer councils around the country who help us deliver our extension programs. And so my point here is not about Blair and Jane and their kids or around Martin, but it is to say I think often we talk about the technical stuff and we talk about our methods and modes of delivery from a very technical point of view, but actually at the end of the day it's about people like this all over the country. You know, for us it's about 12,500 sheep and beef farmers. Many of you as deer farmers are running sheep and beef as well, and so really I think the standout thing for me from these very early stages of the Red Meat Profit Partnership in terms of updating you is not so much about silver bullet technologies or systems. You know, hopefully some of that might come, but of course it's never that simple, but it is thinking much more fundamentally at the start of every project we do about who's the user, what is it that really drives them, what is it that delivers on fundamentally better financial outcomes on farm, and how do we design that into our products and services right from the very start. Thanks very much.
Questions for Scott? Anybody? This one.
Scott, how are you? No, I'm not trying to help Andy out, but just a question on the farm advisors. Was the 35% across all farms or just high-performing farms?
No, so good question, thank you. So that data around trusted advisors and preferred communication channels is taken from survey work that we do every quarter. So we do a random sample of farmers out of our database and just get their sort of rankings around trusted advisors and preferred communication channels. So no, it's not. It's a random sample across the population.
So would you look at the percentage of high-performing farms that use farm advisors?
Yeah, absolutely. No, a really good point. And I think in that sort of target diagram, if you like, there at the end, independent advice, good data, do go right to the heart of why I think fundamentally there's a key role for rural professionals, farm management consultants, whatever you want to call them. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Scott, how do you think you're going to use this information to change what you do in terms of improving uptake of technology or information or productivity growth? Have you got that far yet as an organisation to really think about that?
Yeah, no, we're thinking about it, and we haven't quite landed what it all means yet. I mean, I think we're starting to see some of it just creep into our language and the way we talk. It's really interesting. Who here is well, that's a dumb question. The health and safety debate that's going on in farming at the moment, it's really interesting. About 2 months ago, I was contacted by a journalist, and they said to me, so what's happening at beef and lamb? And I made an off-the-cuff comment about there's a lot of concern amongst farmers around health and safety and where the legislation's going. There's no doubt we've got an issue in our sector and we need to address it, but we also need to have tools available to run our farms, and quad bikes are the touchstone issue. I'd been thinking about this stuff a bit, and I sort of, very dangerous to think aloud with journalists, but I sort of thought aloud. And I said, look, I think, and they said, why do you think farmers are upset? And I said, I think one of the issues is that there's a real concern in this discussion around where can I take my children, what do I do when visitors are on farm, that there's sort of a collision between the family values of farming and where farmers perceive it as of today, some of that legislation might be going. And so we are a little bit different to the other sectors of interest. So the others are construction, manufacturing and forestry, and in all of those we leave a workplace or a forestry site and we go home. In farming we intimately mix the workplace and the farm. And so I said, I think there's a bit of a clash of a clash with the family farming values going on here. I never get any response to comments I make in the media, or if I do, it's often negative. And I think I had about 15, possibly a few more emails from farmers I haven't met or I haven't met through our programs before, just saying, really important that people talk about family values in some of these debates about regulation. And so it really struck me. I mean, I know n equals 15 is not a big number, but it's 15 times bigger than I usually get. And so it suggested me that something's going on. And so, Andy, in reference to your question, I think one of the things for us is just thinking about some of that discussion, using that to perhaps facilitate discussions in field days and discussion groups and profit partnerships or whatever the forum might be, to draw out the things that are important, and then to think about how do you come up with technological and innovation solutions that are perhaps matched to all of those interests, not just the animal nutrition component or the animal health component or the forage component or whatever it might be, but think about all of the people-based complexities in that as well. Yeah. So no, I don't have an answer, but I think it's an ongoing conversation.
I wonder if you could just comment on my personal belief, actually, that beef and lamb would be better off to look at more core research than worry about extension to farmers, because there's a whole business out there doing that, and they, as you've already pointed out, they get multiple papers in the mail all the time.
Yep.
And they sort through that stuff and they figure out what they need.
Yep.
What I think we desperately need is more basic core research to add value to those publications. And I think that you might be limiting yourself a little bit by saying to ag research that you've got to put a case together to explain the extension before you've even gone to that core research.
Yeah, so a couple of responses to that. We do both. So we invest we invest more in R&D than we do in extension, but we fundamentally believe that if farmers are going to get value from either work that we generate or work that others generate, ag research, etc., the research providers, then there needs to be a good channel to get that out to farmers that farmers can participate in themselves. So we think it's a key activity for us. And certainly those programs in terms of farmer response over the last 5 years have grown. So for example, last year we ran 362 events, I think, and about 17,000 attendees across those. And that's about 6,200 unique attendees, 5,500 farmers, the rest are agribusiness. So we do both. And I think, so from my point of view, I think having that way to get information to farmers and farmers to participate in that, in the awareness, the knowledge, is important, as well as doing the R&D. Absolutely, there are others out there who do that as well, whether it's commercial providers of services like seed companies, whether it's farm management consultants. But often what we're doing is creating a place where some of those things can come together and look at sort of whole issues. I'd love to have more money for R&D. Sometimes I look at my Dairy and Z counterparts and the amount of funding they have available to them, and I look at it a little bit enviously. We will go into another 6-year term from first quarter next year, so we're doing really active thinking about, do we need to change our emphases in our programs right now? So I'm happy to, people want to collar me when I'm here for dinner tonight. And I had an email from a farmer in southern South Island this morning who shared exactly your view, talking about, as you're thinking about what you want to put together for the next 6 years, think about whether we need more R&D funding. So that's something that we have to make those choices between the programs all the time. But it's a good point. And also there's a question for us within the R&D funding as well. What's your balance between the really big blue sky stuff, basic science, versus the applied stuff? And so that's something we have to think about too.
Another one of those vet fellas that's on your list there, and you've just been talking to another one, so there's a few of us here. But I'm a veterinarian who works very closely on a daily basis with a lot of clients. And I never cease to be amazed, even after 35 years, in terms of the absolute skill and the dedication and that of the people that are achieving well. And one of your first graphs gave you the big clue as to where you go forward. Because out at the end, you've got a little bunch of people that are doing exceedingly well.
And it blips up at the end.
And it blips up
Yep.
at the end. And if you want to actually take the industry forward at some sort of pace, these are the people that you actually have to go out and spend time with. Because these people have analysed and taken apart every other piece of information that's come through the mailbox, that's come through everything that's been provided. They use their advisors. But the big difference with those people is they have actually made it work.
Yep.
And they've turned it into profit, and they keep doing it. And another reason farmers get cheesed off is because they read in the papers how they're not taking up technology. And this is wrong. These guys are not stupid. They actually take and look at the pieces of technology, and then they find the faults in it. And they actually see that this is a shallow piece of research that's being shoveled onto them and told that's going to make them more money. And the reason why they watch other farmers, and the best ones, is that they wait till they see that that person can turn it into cash. Then they will actually implement that piece of technology. And that's where your field days come into a big role, because they actually go to people that have been able to take a little piece of research from somewhere and put it into their farming business and turn it into profit. And that's what actually drives an industry to go forward. But to tell a farmer that he's a bit slow and he's not taking up all this technology and new research, you're vastly underestimating the actual skill, the knowledge, and the sheer intelligence of a whole lot of those people that are out there working. So as industries, we should actually work together, look at what the guys out front are doing, because they're probably in front of the research in a lot of cases, and then see how we can help the industry pick up on that technology, pick up on their skills, see how they've fitted it into their whole business, and then we have solutions. We don't have ideas, we work to give people solutions.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And a point that one of our extension managers made at AgResearch this morning, talking to the AgResearch scientists, was the two things about a great field day is a great topic, so technical interest, but just a great farm and a great host that's doing well and implementing the stuff that will bring people into that conversation. So, you know, those high performers, how do you lift the lid on some of that stuff? And one of the great things about our sector is people are prepared to share. Plenty of other sectors around the place where the high performers won't share. And that's one of the great things about agriculture. The other point I'd make is that I remember a colleague of mine who was a social scientist years ago when I was an active researcher said to me, Scott, always remember there are real reasons for non-adoption. And it's about unpicking those and sort of understanding, well, if it didn't work, why? And what was fundamentally wrong with the way we delivered it or the technology, and how do we correct that? So, yeah, absolutely.
So last one there with Campbell, and then we'll...
Yeah, you were saying the thing about broadband rollout. Well, man, it's not happening in our area. And it's getting to be a major factor.
Yep.
You know, satellite costs us quite a bit of money to keep all that running for us and our staff. The other thing is they just whacked up a new cell tower just out of Otrahonga. Well, it's still not bloody high enough to get to us. And the government needs pressure on them to roll it out. Key came out the other day and said, oh, we're going to put more cell phone towers around tourist areas. Well, thanks, mate.
Yeah, and no, I agree entirely. And so I guess my point is to say it's better than it used to be, but I hear that sort of comment all the time. And one of the realities, I guess, for the sheep and beef sector is when a provider says, you know, we cover 97% of the population with our coverage or whatever, you know that we're the 3%. Or the 2% or the 1% or whatever it's going to be. And it's a fundamental challenge that when more and more services, and we're doing the same thing, are being delivered electronically, you're disenfranchising those farmers if they can't actually access some of that stuff. So I think some of that's why some of the traditional methods are still really important and really popular. And I think you can use the electronic ones to some extent, but you can't abandon the traditional ones either. So you've sort of got to stack them up. But take your point from a policy perspective, I guess your message is keep the pressure on the government.